Two sisters vanish on a rainy night in Cebu, the Philippines. No witnesses, no clear evidence, just a body later found that may not even be theirs. 7 young men are arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. But 45 witnesses swore the main suspect was 350 miles away that night. Decades later, the questions haven't stopped about the witnesses ignored, the star witness tortured, and the powerful names linked to the case. This is the story of the Chiong sisters case, one of the most controversial crimes in Philippine history. The storm hit Cebu City hard that night. Glass windows shook with every thunderclap. It was just past midnight on July 16, 1997, and under the wet glow of Ayala Center's lights, 2 sisters, Mary Joy and Jacqueline Chiong, stood waiting. Taxi after taxi passed by, already full or unwilling to stop in the heavy rain. Even in this busy city where life never stops for weather, nobody expected 2 young women to simply vanish into the night, not in such a public place. Inside a small apartment in Cebu, rain drummed on the tin roof as Thelma Chiong paced nervously. Maybe the storm had delayed her daughters, maybe they found shelter somewhere. She kept thinking of all the possibilities, but as the hours dragged on, those hopeful thoughts began to fade. She sent her sons, Bruce and Dennis, into the stormy streets to search. They checked every corner, every shadow that moved in the rain, but nothing. Thelma waited by the phone all night. No call, no knock on the door. The girls didn't come home. By morning, she called the police, but the responses wasn't urgent. Officers told her to wait it out. Most missing people come back on their own, they said. But Thelma knew her daughters. These weren't runaways. By noon, worry had turned into desperation. Family and friends split into search groups, checking alleys, bus stops, and parking lots. Their voices echoed through the wet streets, calling the girls' names. But Cebu stayed silent. Within hours, panic replaced hope. Thelma and her husband Dionisio went straight to the police station, filing missing persons reports and pressing photos of their daughters into the hands of detectives. There was no ransom call, no note, no demands, just terrifying silence and the suffocating fear that something evil had slipped through the city's cracks while everyone else carried on as usual. Meanwhile, 350 miles north in Manila, a different kind of energy filled the air. Francisco Juan Paco Laranya was celebrating the end of his culinary school exams with friends in Quezon City. At 19 years old, he was living the life of a privileged young man, partying late, dreaming of his future as a chef, surrounded by classmates who would later swear under oath about every detail of that night. Paco Laranya had no idea that his name was quietly being written onto a list of suspects. He was having a great night, drinks, laughter, normal teenage fun. But in just hours, his world would collapse into something unimaginable. July 17th, Cebu woke up sticky and tense. Police began their investigation, interviewing taxi drivers, checking security cameras, chasing any lead that might show where the sisters were last seen. But the storm had washed away much of the evidence. Footprints were gone, voices were blurred by rain, faces were hidden behind fogged car windows. And rumors spread faster than facts. Security guards at the mall, tricycle drivers, late-night workers, they all shook their heads. Nobody had seen the girls leave. 2 young women had vanished in the middle of the crowded city, swallowed by the rain and darkness. National media picked up the story. Reporters gathered, radio shows stirred up panic, talking about crime and disappearances. In Cebu, a place already full of ghost stories and unsolved mysteries, this case fed into something larger and darker. But inside the Chiong home, there was only waiting, watching the clock, calling anyone who might have seen their daughters take one last ride. By the end of July 17th, nobody knew if Mary Joy and Jacqueline were alive or dead. 2 days after the sisters vanished, a fisherman named Rudy Lasaga was walking in the jungle trails in Tanawan, Karkar. It's far outside the city where cliffs drop sharply to the sea and thick weeds grow everywhere. And there, at the edge of a cliff, he saw something that didn't belong. The body of a young woman, handcuffed, broken from violence and from the fall. Even the rain couldn't hide what had happened to her. Police rushed to the scene. The storm had already washed away most clues. But the body was there, caught in the brush and rocks, wearing an orange shirt and jeans. By mid-morning, word had spread. Dentist Chiong went to the funeral home. He could barely look at the injuries, but the family was sure they knew who it was. It was Mary Joy. Everything changed for the Chiongs in that moment. One daughter was returned, but the price was horror, a sister destroyed, an ending nobody deserved. And as they grieved, the questions became more painful. Where was Jacqueline? What happened on the night they disappeared? What made it worse was what police called the perfect storm. Heavy rain had wiped away tracks, blurred timelines, and confused witnesses. There wasn't a single clear lead. The mall, so well lit and supposedly secure, offered no answers. At a detective's desk, a criminal database search brought up a name, Francisco Juan Paco Larraña. Not because he was near the crime scene, not because he had ever contacted the sisters, but because of an incident from 2 years earlier. In 1995, a high school student named Rochelle Vertuccio had filed a complaint. She said that as she was leaving school with classmates, a black Honda Civic pulled up beside them. Paco had gotten out of the car and tried to force her inside, but was unsuccessful. The case went nowhere at the time. It was noted, filed, and forgotten until now. To desperate police, this was their break. Paco was young, wealthy, from a privileged family. He had a reputation for getting into fights and running with the wrong crowd. He wasn't anonymous. And in a country desperate for answers, he fit the perfect villain role. A face people could blame, a rich kid's name that would sell newspapers and calm a panicked public. The fact that he was in Manila, 350 miles away, barely seemed to matter. In a city gripped by fear, logic took a backseat. The media built the story quickly. Paco was painted as the spoiled rich boy, the playboy who partied too much at nightclubs. He became the dark opposite of the innocent Chiong sisters. Later, experts would point to this as the turning point, because sometimes all it takes is a name and a narrative. As days passed, the stories grew wilder. Some neighbors claimed they'd see Jacqueline alive outside Cebu. Others said a taxi driver had lied about his passengers that night. Rumors multiplied and panic spread. And what stayed constant was the fear. Every young woman in Cebu was told to watch her back. Families checked their doors twice before dark. With every day that Jacqueline remained missing, police grew more desperate for answers, and every new tip sent the investigation spinning in new, fruitless directions. Jacqueline's absence ate at everyone like an open wound. Each day she remained missing, the police grew more desperate. In the media, the sisters became symbols of innocence destroyed. Paco Larraña, meanwhile, went from student to suspect to public enemy. The Chiong case dominated every newspaper and radio station. As the city waited for answers, police shifted from searching for the missing to looking for someone to blame. Was this a crime of passion, a warning from a drug gang, or something even darker? Behind closed doors, another name surfaced, Peter Lim, an alleged drug kingpin whose influence, some said, reached deep into the city's power structure. And this wasn't just gossip. Hidden in early police reports was a detail that should have raised red flags. Dionisio Chiong, the girl's father, had been scheduled to testify as a witness against Lim in a congressional hearing before his daughters disappeared. It was a small detail, almost forgotten, but in Cebu, coincidences were rarely accidental. Lim's network allegedly included corrupt police officers and silent bodyguards. So when Paco Larraña was arrested at his Manila apartment, it wasn't uniformed officers at the door. Locals later said the men who took him were Lim's boys, plainclothes police who also worked as the drug lord's private security. For Paco, it was the beginning of a nightmare, a sudden arrest by men who weren't even official police, and the overwhelming sense that his fate was now tied to forces much larger than a simple criminal case. The Chiongs weren't just any grieving family, they had direct access to the highest levels of power. Thelma's sister, Cheryl Jumenia, worked as an aide to President Joseph Estrada, and this meant one phone call could reach the president's office. In the Philippines, when a case gets presidential attention, everyone in the system feels the heat. Police work harder, prosecutors push for maximum sentences, and judges know their careers are being watched. What should have been a straightforward investigation had become a political priority. From the very beginning, this case carried the weight of influence, making it more controversial. For months, the case went cold. Forensics offered little help. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Mary Joy's death certificate was signed and Jacqueline remained missing. Then almost a year after that stormy night, the prosecution got their breakthrough. Davidson Valiente Rusia entered the picture, a figure pulled from Cebu's criminal underworld, a known gang member already serving time. He had something the case desperately needed: a story. In exchange for complete immunity from prosecution, he was willing to tell everything. And Rusia painted a detailed picture. He said he watched the sisters get kidnapped, held in a safe house, and saw Mary Joy thrown off a cliff with her wrists still chained. According to his testimony, he just sat in the car and watched while others did the kidnapping. He claimed he stayed in the living room while the others assaulted the victims in separate rooms. He said he didn't help throw Mary Joy off the cliff and left early, not even knowing what happened to Jacqueline. But during his brief cross-examination, a devastating truth slipped out. Rusia admitted he had raped Mary Joy. Suddenly, the innocent bystander became a participant in one of the most serious crimes. But this is where the case gets disturbing. For the Chiongs, his confession felt like a miracle. Even though this man raped her daughter, Thelma called him a gift from God. She even brought him birthday cakes in prison, showing public gratitude mixed with quiet relief. Because no matter what the circumstances, at last, here was a witness the case could build on. They began exchanging gifts and developing what observers called an inappropriate friendship. This bizarre relationship raised questions about whether the grieving mother was more interested in finding someone to blame than finding the truth. But Rusia's background was messy. He was a convicted felon who had been sentenced to prison twice in the United States for burglary and other crimes. He had shifting loyalties and secrets he kept to himself. Behind the scenes, critics wondered, was he truly a savior or just the missing piece the system needed, no matter how unreliable? What made Rusia's testimony even more questionable was how it came about. Fellow prisoners later claimed they witnessed him being tortured by police before he confessed. Despite this, his story became the foundation of the prosecution's case. The legal wheels moved forward. Using Rusia's testimony, police and prosecutors built their case: abduction, rape, and murder. By early 1998, faith in the truth was hanging by a thread, and everyone caught in the case could feel the pressure building. The courtroom was packed when the trial began on August 12, 1998. Prosecutors told a story of violence and horror that captivated the nation. Defense lawyers tried to speak, but the tide of headlines and public opinion was already against them. People crowded the hallways, eager for details they'd already decided were true. The system moved with procedural speed, but little fairness. The prosecution relied heavily on Davidson Rusia, their star witness. Despite his lengthy direct testimony that lasted days, he said he saw everything. The sisters kidnapped, held captive, abused, and Mary Joy thrown from a cliff. 21 other witnesses backed up parts of his story. People who claimed to see suspicious cars near the mall, whispers of threats in bars and parking lots. Most of it was circumstantial, but it all looked convincing when presented together. However, there was a shocking disparity in how witnesses were treated. While Rusia was allowed to testify for days, Paco's defense counsel was given only 30 minutes for cross-examination. In that brief time, they managed to expose serious cracks in Rusia's story. His criminal record, his lies to the court, and his constantly changing accounts. When confronted with evidence of his prior convictions for burglary and forgery, which he had denied under oath, Rusia broke down completely. He fainted in court, gasps filled the room, and cameras captured every moment. Doubt spread through the nation. But it didn't change the outcome. His testimony stood, protected by his immunity deal, and the prosecution's insistence that, true or not, it was what Cebu needed to believe. The defense had something almost unheard of in Philippine criminal trials, a documented alibi with receipts. 45 witnesses lined up to swear under oath that Paco Larraña was 350 miles away in Quezon City, attending culinary school and surrounded by friends and teachers. They presented documented proof including school attendance records showing he was taking exams, restaurant receipts from the party he attended, security guard logs when he returned to his condominium at 2:45 a.m., testimony from classmates, teachers, and even airline personnel. Each piece of evidence lined up perfectly. The prosecution had no way to disprove any of it. But Judge Martin Ocampo, conscious of the cameras and wary of the crowds, made a devastating decision. He declared that the defense's witness list was too much. After hearing only 14 witnesses, he stopped the rest from testifying. Crucial evidence was silenced while the court moved on to judgment. Making matters worse, Judge Ocampo's behavior during the trial was highly questionable. Observers noted that he often dozed off during proceedings and even answered questions on behalf of Rusia when the witness was being cross-examined. He also jailed defense lawyers for protesting his decision to throw out expert testimony that questioned whether the body found was actually Mary Joy's. Paco himself was never allowed to tell his side of the story. A deal between lawyers and the judge meant his voice was completely silenced. The case tipped not because the facts were clear, but because the rules bent under public pressure and media attention. Adding to the controversy, it was later revealed that all of the prosecution witnesses had been paid for their testimony. This revelation raised serious questions about the validity of their statements and the integrity of the entire case. Outside the courthouse, the city was divided. Some cried for justice for Mary Joy and Jacqueline. Others marched for Paco, demanding fairness and due process. Cebu was split down in the middle, and the tension was electric. On May 5th, 1999, Paco was found guilty. But in a surprising twist, the regional trial court sentenced Paco and 6 others to life imprisonment, reclusion perpetua, not death. Behind closed doors, Judge Ocampo later admitted to reporters that key facts, including whether the body was really Mary Joy's, were never fully proven. "You don't know the pressure I'm under," he said, exhausted and clearly struggling with the weight of the decision. The initial trial court decision found the defendants guilty of kidnapping and serious illegal detention of Jacqueline Chiong, but ruled there was insufficient evidence to convict them of homicide and rape of Mary Joy Chiong. And this distinction would later become crucial. 5 months after the verdict, the nation woke to shocking news. Judge Ocampo had taken his own life. Rumors and suspicions swirled again. Had the pressure become too much? Was there more to the story? There would never be answers. The Chiong family was outraged that the defendants hadn't received the death penalty. With their political connections, they pushed back hard. President Estrada, influenced by the family's ties to his administration, personally asked the Department of Justice to seek harsher sentences. So the case was appealed to the Supreme Court, where everything changed again. On February 3, 2004, the Supreme Court delivered its final ruling: death by lethal injection. The nation watched as the highest court in the land overturned the lower court's decision and imposed the ultimate penalty. For Paco, hope vanished in a single day. Newspapers called it justice. But behind the headlines, serious problems were emerging. International human rights groups pointed to missing evidence, a compromised trial, and a culture of finding scapegoats rather than seeking truth. The Supreme Court's decision was particularly controversial because it convicted the defendants of crimes that the trial court had found insufficient evidence for. The Supreme Court found Paco guilty of the homicide and rape of Mary Joy Chiong despite the trial court's original finding that there wasn't enough evidence for these charges. Spanish diplomats stepped in immediately. Paco, holding dual Filipino-Spanish citizenship through his Basque heritage, became the center of an international diplomatic crisis. Spain had abolished the death penalty and was obligated to protect its citizens from execution abroad. Law associations from Barcelona, Madrid, and the Basque Country sent legal briefs to Philippine courts. The European Parliament and the United Nations received urgent appeals, calling the trial a gross miscarriage of justice that fell far short of international legal standards. In 2007, Spain and the Philippines signed a prisoner transfer treaty. Under this agreement, Spanish citizens convicted of crimes in the Philippines could serve their sentences in Spanish prisons, though they would still be bound by the terms of their Philippine convictions. The Philippines ended the death penalty in 2006, commuting all death sentences to life imprisonment. But Spain pushed harder for Paco's transfer under the bilateral treaty. By 2009, after years of diplomatic pressure, a quiet agreement was reached. Paco would be transferred to Spain, not to freedom, but to a different kind of prison. On October 6, 2009, escorted by 2 Spanish Interpol agents, Paco flew to Madrid. He arrived at Soto del Real prison, where he traded prison clothes for chef's whites. He finally achieved his dream of becoming a chef, but not the way he had planned. After years in a maximum security prison in Madrid, he was transferred to a lower security facility in San Sebastian. There, Spanish authorities granted him work release. Now he works 4 days a week at a Spanish restaurant, leaving his cell each morning without guards and returning each night. The culinary student who was studying exams in Manila that fateful night in 1997 had become a professional chef in Spain, still serving a life sentence but trusted enough by Spanish authorities to work unsupervised in the community. His mother proudly told reporters she was happy he had finally reached his dream, even under these circumstances. And it's a freedom his 6 co-accused back in Philippine prisons could only imagine. They stay in Philippine prisons, no deals, only slow, grinding years behind bars, trapped between public anger and a failing justice system. Paco is counting years until his potential release in 2038, if the world didn't forget him. But the transfer met strong protest from the Chiong family. Dionisio Chiong, the victim's father, said his family is tired of the case. He also expressed anger that the family only learned about Paco's departure through the media. In 2011, the documentary Give Up Tomorrow premiered at international film festivals. It laid out the hidden truth clearly: an alibi that was ignored, a star witness whose story fell apart under scrutiny, and a trial shaped by fear and political pressure rather than evidence. At the Cebu screening of Give Up Tomorrow, something extraordinary happened. Reporters who had once loudly blamed the defendants stood before the Laranja family and publicly apologized on camera for the harm their coverage had caused. They admitted they had been wrong and had contributed to a rush to judgment. More than 20 years after that night in Cebu, in August 2019, 4 of the 7 convicted men, Jasmine Anzar, Ariel Balansag, Alberto Canyo, and James Anthony Wee, had been released early under the Good Conduct Time Allowance Law. This law was designed to reward good behavior in prison with shorter sentences. But President Rodrigo Duterte moved quickly, firing Bureau of Corrections Chief Nicanor Faldon and calling the releases a disgrace. The 4 men, facing the weight of public anger and fear for their safety, voluntarily returned to prison within days. Decades later, the most haunting aspect of this case remains. Jacqueline Chiong's body was never found. Despite extensive searches and numerous investigations, she simply vanished. Rumors persist that she might still be alive. Over the years, photos have appeared online showing women in Canada and other countries who bear striking resemblances to the missing sister. Social media users and online forums continue to speculate about these sightings. Some people ask an even more disturbing question. Was the entire case built on lies? Was there a cover-up involving powerful people who needed scapegoats to hide the real truth? The connections to alleged drug lord Peter Lim added another layer of mystery. The fact that Dioncio Chiong was scheduled to testify against Lim but changed his mind has never been fully investigated. The involvement of Lim's bodyguards in Paco's arrest raises serious questions about who really controlled the investigation. Someone knows what really happened that night. Someone saw, heard, or helped shape a tragedy that still echoes through the darkest corners of Cebu City. So this case leaves a lot to think about. Can justice exist when political pressure overrides evidence? What happens when the media convicts before the courts do? How do we find truth when witnesses can be paid and tortured? In seeking justice for Marijoy and Jacqueline Chiong, did the Philippines destroy 7 other lives? And if so, who still moves unseen, hidden in the shadows of that stormy night, beyond the reach of law and justice? The storm that took the Chiong sisters never truly passed. Somewhere in the darkness of that July night, the truth waits. The truth that may never be found. That is our story for today. Thanks for watching.